Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Gabriella Hoffman back to the program. It's been a while. I understand you've been quite the traveler and just checked off your 41st state. Congratulations.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, it's good to be back, and I have been traveling. And travel doesn't stop here. I have two things next month. August, I'm going to Alaska for the first time, so state number 42. And this is what I get to do as a 1099 independent worker. So I'm very blessed to do this. And I know today's subject does relate to my lifestyle a little bit and the millions of people who partake in some semblance of 1099K work, especially 1099K work. So very excited to chat that subject with you and break down what's going on, the latest.
Okay, before we dive in here, I know for some people you're going to be a familiar voice, but take just a moment. Tell us just a little bit about what you do for Young Voices as well as otherwise, just so people know who they're hearing from.
Right. So since the last time we spoke, I was promoted to regional leader of the Northeast in Young Voices. So they have deputized us, the initial cohort, and I would say most of our staff is remaining. We had some people go into the roles recently, but yes, I assist with trying to recruit and seek out people to carry out Young Voices message in the Northeast. We've had pretty good success. A lot of our contributors come from the region, but we try to also find others outside of Washington, D.C. I've been very keen on finding people from Pennsylvania, the New England area, and West Virginia, other places. So it's been fun to be in that role. And I get to do a little bit of writing here and there and actually going to do more writing. So maybe I'll come back on the program in the future. But we've grown as an organization, as you've seen, and our other contributors have alluded to, and it's fun. And outside of Young Voices, I work with Independent Women's Forum and their Center for Energy and Conservation. I work with another free market environmental organization where I produce a series called Conservation Nation. I run a podcast, and too many things to list. But when I'm not talking about energy and conservation, I'm often talking about small business, independent contracting, labor issues with good folks like you on this type of platform. So I have many interests, but I would say several of the niches that really stick out to me are true conservation, small business, and defending the little guy, little gal from attacks from the federal government in such a manner. Let's talk about
the whole 1099 business. I'm an independent contractor too, so the 1099 is a form that's near and dear to my heart. But for those who are not familiar with it, when we talk 1099K, what's the difference between that and a standard 1099?
Right. So a 1099, I think most everyone, if you've engaged either in part-time work or occasional work and you've made over $600, you will be triggered. A form will be triggered for you to, let's say, make note of your work if it exceeds that denomination. Dollars for 1099 regular. 1099K now, it used to be, I'm going to make the clear distinction. This form used to only be triggered if you would have 200 transactions exceeding $20,000 annually. With this new provision in the American Rescue Plan, which is a very problematic provision now, people didn't realize this at the time, but they included it thinking that we have to extract more taxes from taxpayers. We're billions of dollars short. Why don't we find a way to do it this way? Thinking it doesn't hurt the smallest moneymaker or revenue maker in the process. And so what this provision did, with largely a Democrat majority passage, no Republicans, to my knowledge, supported the American Rescue Plan. So it was passed on a bipartisan basis with this really problematic provision in place. And so what it did, it lowered that threshold to any transaction you make as a casual seller. And typically casual sellers make no more than annually $5,000. So these are people who are not paying. I mean, it's not like they're skirting taxes. They are paying something. But these are people who are not making consequential amount of money to be having a 1099K form triggered according to old standards. And so anything exceeding $601 now triggers once it goes into effect. I believe late, they put like a year pause on it. So I think by the end of this year, this will actually go into effect after the pause, unless Congress is somehow able to put a stopgap to this provision. They use the Congressional Review Act, some maneuver like that, and are able to stop that from being implemented. But as it stands right now, the IRS is going to proceed with this even after a year pause, as of our speaking today with this recording. And so a lot of people are very nervous that this is very invasive. And I mean, we all should be skeptical of the IRS. I do not like paying more money. And as I make more money, and as any independent contractor makes more money, we're forking over more money to the federal government. This past tax season alone, I had to fork a bigger percentage than I normally did because I've been making more money. So they like to punish us for making more money. This is not a anarchist statement, but I think the more you pay in taxes, the more you see, like, where's your tax money going? Did the government have a hand in your business? No, it didn't. But even though the denomination of money that people are making as 1099K filers potentially or surrendering is substantially lower than, let's say, someone like me who's making a lot more money as an independent contractor, I feel for these people. And I do not like the stipulations of the IRS because the IRS can exploit this provision and go after a casual seller. Not only because the denomination is a lot lower, like I said, on average, these casual sellers only make $5,000 annually. That's almost infinitesimally small in the grand scheme of things of how money is taxed and whatnot. But also a big concern is if the IRS is doing this for such a smaller denomination, what are they going to use their powers? What are these 87,000 new agents across 10 years that they plan to hire? What are they going to use with this new power through this new 1099K threshold, reporting threshold? They're going to go after people and say, why didn't you file this correctly if you're reselling used goods? As anyone knows, if you're reselling used goods, you're not the original owner. You don't know what the original price is, perhaps. You don't have the original receipts, and you're making a loss whenever you're selling that product for what it originally was appraised for and what it originally cost. You're not having any capital gains with it. You're not making more money unless you're using some sort of formula to make more money off of used goods than the original price. Great. That's awesome. But I think most of these resellers, these casual resellers, are taking a loss with these things that they resell on casual marketplaces. So this could invite potentially from the IRS. Many have noted this. The IRS this filing will make it so you have to put down your address, your social security number, other sensitive data they shouldn't be getting for such a small denomination of money. Then they're going to essentially bully these casual sellers and say, like, okay, if we don't have any receipt of you, like, being the original owner, we're going to hound you down and, like, hold you responsible for this. Like I said, they didn't even have capital gains. They don't make much money from reselling these products. So it's going to be extremely hard to enforce this, especially as these people are secondhand or third-hand owners of these goods they're selling. So we have the IRS being more powerful for such a smaller denomination of money. We have this privacy component too, them having these powers and extracting so much sensitive information for, like I said, over $600, barely $600. That's bizarre any way you look at it. And then also trying to have this enforcement mechanism where they're going to have to prove that they're not the original seller and owner of these goods, that they're secondhand, third-hand sellers. Many problems instead in this. And I think with the IRS becoming more problematic, we aren't able to place trust in it as an agency because they have a history of fraud and abuse. This past year, the Government Accountability Office, as I noted in my article for Young Voices, it said that there were trillions of dollars lost from the agency. And across a decade, they have lost, again, trillions of dollars. This past year, they lost about several $100 million or $1 billion that went unaccounted for. Not surprising that happens. And then in the span of a decade, they have lost several $1 trillion of money, and it goes unreported, or that money gets mismanaged rather. And so how can you trust an agency that doesn't know how to balance its own budget, needs all these copious billions and trillions of dollars to sustain itself, when in fact they don't enforce things equally? They're pretty aggressive in their enforcement mechanisms, and they have a problem with stewarding money very well. So that's something that your listeners have to take into account with this 1099K threshold. Even if you're not affected, you should be concerned as a taxpayer because the agency can't be trusted with how they steward taxpayer dollars. They're seeing it. So people question, why am I paying this amount of money in income taxes, federal, state income taxes? We as 1099K filers pay self-employment tax, so we pay additional taxes than a conventional employee. So we're paying more. And then these poor people who this is not their primary profession, they're going to have to be taxed further and more scrupulously because of this new threshold that's been downgraded. Very problematic all around.
I'm going to be honest, Gabriella, you are dampening my enthusiasm for the IRS. I'm kidding. No, I appreciate your take on this, and that was such a great breakdown of it. Look, it sounds like, a lot of people who will be affected by this aren't even necessarily, 1099 independent contractors so much as maybe just somebody that has a side hustle, to kind of help make ends meet or have some fun money or travel money. And it sounds like they're taking aim at them. We have about 30 seconds left. Is there any meaningful way to rein in the IRS or anybody talking like they might be interested in doing that?
It depends who you talk to, because there are people who have said the IRS needs to be shrunken. It needs to have its powers defanged. We see some presidential candidates talk about this. As it stands in Congress, it may be impossible to rein in the powers unless you get some moderate Democrats to do that. We may see an appetite of moderate Democrats perhaps doing that very soon. Like I said, Congressional Review Act, that's the only way right now that you could repeal this. There are several bills to increase the threshold to the original amount, 20,000, 200 transactions, and 10,000, 5,000. So it remains to be seen what we've done, but hopefully some reforms come soon.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Joshua Crawford back to the show. I'm going to call him Josh because that's what I call him. But Josh, for people meeting you for the first time, we know you're a Young Voices contributor. Tell me about what else you do.
Yeah, so I'm the Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives for the Georgia Center for Opportunity, which means most of my time is spent working with city and state government officials all over the country to try to reduce urban violence, gang violence in particular.
All right. And I'm looking at an article that you co-authored with Paul H. Robinson on Newsweek, Progressive Prosecutors and the Inconvenient Democratic Will. And I've heard rumblings of this. In fact, I guess as I watch the news and I see, California basically saying, well, if it's less than $950, we won't even consider it, anything more than a misdemeanor. And now they're passing laws that would seem to, in effect, legalize shoplifting and so forth. But I never really considered a punishment-free society until I started seeing that kind of stuff. Has this move been around for a while?
Yeah, really, the progressive prosecutor movement has gotten a lot of attention over the last couple of years because of the things that you're talking about. These no prosecution memos where they're saying for any theft under this offense or simple assaults or simple drug possessions, we won't prosecute, right? And they sort of started with the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that a lot of people are sort of like, oh, I don't necessarily think that that's all that bad. But in truth, this movement is just sort of the latest iteration of the anti-punishment movement, which is to say that punishment in and of itself is wrong. It's wrong across the board. It's wrong for those things that you may think are kind of piddly, but it's also wrong for the big stuff. And this is what you're seeing with a lot of these prosecutors, that they start with the little stuff, but they're actually doing a lot more to try to curb punishment as it relates to some very serious offenses as well.
Now, you point out in your article, and I would agree with this, I think most of us, even as kids, we instinctively understand that, when somebody does something seriously wrong, they need to answer for it, meaning there is a time and a place for punishment. Where does this idea that, no, punishment doesn't work and really should never be utilized, where does that come from? Who pushes it?
Well, it's an idea so silly that only academics could really believe in it. And so that is primarily where it's located within some of the elite universities and within the pages of certain peer-reviewed journals. But it's made its way sort of into the activist class on the left as well, some of the language. And some of it is well-meaning, right? A lot of us believe in rehabilitation, second chances, things like that, wanting to see people rejoin civil society after they've done something wrong. But what it ignores is the recognition that both across time and across cultures, people believe that if you do something wrong, there are consequences for doing that wrong thing, regardless of what moving forward looks like, right? Again, we all want people to criminally offend less moving forward. We want people to become productive members of society after they've done something wrong. But again, across cultures and across time, there has always been a belief that if you do something wrong, there's consequences for that.
So is it just semantics then when we talk about punishment versus accountability? I mean, for instance, maybe there's something to be said for when someone has harmed another person or harmed their property. It's their duty as part of making that right to restore as best they can whatever wrong they've done. Is that the same? That seems to me like accountability. Is that synonymous with punishment, or does punishment take it further than that?
Yeah, punishment necessarily needs to be uncomfortable and undesirable, right? And so that can take a wide variety of different forms. We typically think about it in the context of incarceration or formal things like that. But it could be compelling someone to do something, to give up something in favor of the benefit of someone else because they've done them wrong. It can take a wide variety of forms. But the key there is that it's uncomfortable and it's undesirable, right? And again, across time, it's taken many different forms. I mean, corporal punishment for a long time in human history was the preferred and typical form of punishment. We don't use corporal punishment anymore. We don't use whippings or lashings or anything like that. The primary form of punishment today is imprisonment. And there are other benefits to that type of incapacitation. But punishment itself can take a wide variety of forms.
Okay. Now, what's the danger when a society starts moving away from holding people accountable, from punishing serious wrongdoing? What kind of message does that send to those who may be inclined to engage in that kind of behavior?
Yeah, so there's really two consequences. The first and most obvious consequence is if you remove punishment from something that used to have punishment, you're probably going to get more of whatever that thing is, right? It's the sort of inverse of the taxation question. If you want something less, tax it, right? If you want more of something, punish it less as it relates to criminal behavior. The bigger and I think longer term consequence, though, is that you no longer have sort of a North Star for the criminal justice system, right? If all that matters is be it some sort of rehabilitation or some sort of non-offending, then the state can, with whatever means it feels necessary, force a person to do things to get to that point. And so you may have someone who's done something very serious. The sort of running joke, if you will, is that most domestic homicides are actually self-rehabilitative, that the person that is being killed in that instance is the only person that person has any desire to kill, and therefore they're probably not going to kill again by virtue of having killed that person. Well, if all that matters is that the person doesn't offend anymore, then you can theoretically not punish that person at all. By contrast, take somebody who is struggling with very severe addiction, and the goal is to try to get them to stop not only using drugs, but to stop petty theft and things like that. Well, you could force that person into years and years and years of treatment and different kinds of things that amounts to far greater punishment than you have for the very serious offense. And so all of a sudden, the criminal justice system starts to look very contrary to what the average person thinks is right and wrong, right? I would be willing to bet if you sort of Family Feud style polled 100 Americans and asked them if murder was more severe than drug use, I think 100 Americans would tell you that murder is more severe than drug use. But without the sort of punishment principle as your guiding light, then all of a sudden the system doesn't necessarily have to treat those things that way.
Talk to me about the danger, too, of leaving crimes unpunished, or at least the perception that justice is not going to take any kind of a priority. I'll give you an example here in my home state of Idaho. Over the weekend, apparently a father was fed up with a next door neighbor who apparently was doing lewd acts in front of his neighbor's underage daughters, and he went over and killed the guy. Now, he also killed 3 other family members. And, I'm not trying to make out that was a good and righteous thing to do, but it seems like this would open the door to more vigilante type activities if the perception's there that we can't get justice any other way. So if somebody's not going to make a stand, then I guess we'll take matters into our own hands.
Yeah, it's already a huge problem among gangs in cities, right? Retribution is a major driver of violence among gang-affiliated individuals in cities, in part because of this belief that the system won't actually solve the problems. I'll take it into my own hands. I'll handle it. And so that's one of your major problems, is that I tell people all the time that the opposite of retribution is not rehabilitation, the opposite of retribution is revenge. Because in the absence of retribution, which is controlled, is proportional, has all of these limiting factors associated with it, you have revenge, which has no limiting factors, which that individual who was shot and killed may very well have deserved some sort of punishment, but instead an entire family ends up dead because revenge is uncontrolled.
So we've got about 1 minute left. Let's talk solutions. What are some of the things that are on the table to address this trend?
Yeah. So what you're seeing a lot of state legislatures do is sort of reevaluate their criminal codes to make sure, again, that those who need to be punished more severely are. But we're doing this in a more intelligent way than perhaps we ever have before, which is to try to not cast so wide a net that we end up capturing a bunch of people who we end up punishing too severely. And so the real solution is to take a scalpel to the problem of state criminal codes, punish people appropriately, make sure that folks are held accountable when they need to be, but that we don't punish the wrong people too much.
Again, we are talking with Josh Crawford. He's the Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives at the Georgia Center for Opportunity, as well as a Young Voices contributor. Josh, where can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your work?
Yeah, so foropportunity.org is the Georgia Center for Opportunity's website. And then you can follow me on Instagram. It's jcrawford502.
Very good. Thank you so much. I hope we get to talk again soon.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome McKenzie Richards, who is a Young Voices contributor to the program. McKenzie, for those meeting you for the very first time, tell us just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Brian, for having me on today. My name is McKenzie Richards. I'm a policy associate at the Pacific Research Institute, located in California, and I do primarily healthcare policy, a little bit of education policy, and I'm a Young Voices contributor.
Well, it's interesting that you and I are going to be talking today about the pharmacy shortages and pharmacist shortages in relation to, stores closing. I was just talking about this actually just this morning. My wife and I were talking about how hard it must be, particularly in California, to keep a department store or anything like that open just because, of shoplifting and other criminal acts that seem to be minimized. Talk to me a little bit about why pharmacies keep closing and to what extent does that lax approach on crime play into that?
For sure. So, we hear a lot about California crime or crime in, inner cities, especially exacerbated after COVID. And you've heard a lot about different grocery stores closing and other necessary, locations closing as a result of this, organized crime. Also, pharmacies are closing, and that's causing pharmacy deserts, which affects the most vulnerable among us.
Wow. So let's talk about specifically drugstores, because I hear talk of Target's closing and some of these stores that are shutting down because they're being looted on a regular basis. But I have not heard as much emphasis on pharmacies. But I could see that being a much bigger problem, just given the sheer number of people who they have monthly medications that they depend on. What does the trend look like in terms of drugstores closing?
Yes. So, pharmacies, one thing to keep in mind with pharmacies, a lot of the items that they sell are small in size, but high in value and are easily resold online. And so what you see a lot of the time is that the items that are stolen, pharmacies are targeted because of this. It makes it easier for organized crime rings to go into pharmacies and, steal these items. And we're seeing, there's closures across the board. Walgreens, Rite Aid, CVS have all announced large closures. CVS has announced 300 stores are going to be closing nationwide each year for the next 3 years.
Wow.
That largely impacts inner cities and rural communities who need access to medications. This is a very serious problem. And, for some people, perhaps they can get mail-in prescriptions, but for a lot of people, that might not work.
So what options does that leave, for instance, for people in these areas where their drugstores are shutting down? I know the obvious answer is, well, just drive a little further and go get your medications. Why is that a problem, though, for some people?
Yeah. So, for me, I had a Rite Aid close in my neighborhood. I lived in Riverside. It was boarded up. It kept getting robbed. For me, I could drive an extra 5-10 minutes to the Rite Aid, which was in a safer neighborhood anyway. But I am friends with this woman, and she was formerly homeless. I would drive her to church on Sundays. And one day we were driving past this Rite Aid that closed in her neighborhood, and she bitterly commented and said, I can't get my medication anymore. And she has like a plethora of health problems. She had a broken leg, broken hips, from when she was homeless, she got hit by a car. And so for her, she really relies on Ubers, friends helping her get to these locations for, to get medications. But for a lot of people, they just simply go without. This really impacts vulnerable populations in inner city areas.
So I can see why particularly organized theft and shoplifting would be a huge disincentive to keeping a store open. I mean, look, these are businesses. They're not in business to give everything away to, the first person to come in and take it out the door. But what about pharmacists themselves? You mentioned in your article there's quite a shortage of pharmacists. Why is that?
Sure, of course. So, the issue of pharmacy closures is multifaceted. It's not just crime. And of course, some states have better crime laws. Another issue has to do with what you mentioned is pharmacist accreditations. So about 4 years ago, pharmacy groups lobbied to, close down accreditation for new pharmacy schools. And so what we're seeing is a shortage of pharmacists just to, man these pharmacies. And so a lot of these, Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, they can't keep their stores open long enough. They're shortening hours, or they're not able to keep their pharmacies open at all. And so that amounts to, pharmacy deserts as well. Is even if a pharmacy doesn't close necessarily, shortening hours can effectively, cut off supply for those who need access to get their medication.
This is kind of near and dear to me because when was it? About 4 years ago, my son went to school to he wanted to start pre-pharmacy. He had his sights set on, I'm going to be a pharmacist. And about his first semester in, he changed his major because he said, I don't know what trends he was looking at. He was reading the tea leaves correctly though, and said, yeah, it doesn't look like it's going to pay to be a pharmacist, in the years ahead. So he went ahead and got a degree in biochemistry, which is actually going to serve him well. But I was surprised. I always thought that would be one of the more secure, always needed kind of professions. I didn't realize there could be an ebb and flow in pharmacists.
Yeah, it's funny. We had a pharmacist shortage back in 2000, and to meet that demand, many new pharmacy schools opened. Just supply and demand, letting the market behave as it naturally would. But when pharmacy groups lobby to close down schools or limit that accreditation, for fear that maybe there's too many pharmacists, what that has led to as a result is now people aren't able to get their medication, and so in a timely fashion or maybe not at all. And so, I think that pharmacy groups and pharmacy schools really need to look at increasing opportunities for people like, your son who want to get out there and get those degrees so that they can help people.
Yeah, well, and my dad was a pharmacist, so it was kind of like, oh, cool, we're keeping the tradition going. But it sounds like, for multiple reasons, that's not an easy industry to be in at this moment. So let's talk solutions, McKenzie. What is being done to help protect the interests of drugstores so that we don't see these continued closings? First of all, what can be done?
Sure. So in terms of policy for crime, one bill that we're looking at right now is AB 1708. It's still in committee. It's in California. And basically this would help crack down on repeat offenders. In California, they have pretty lax policies when it comes to, the limit of what people are allowed to steal in terms of what's defined as petty theft. And they have pretty lax policies in repeat offenders. This would help reverse that. Another bill that's actually what came through from Congress is the Inform Act. And the Inform Act helps crack down on reselling goods online. And that came into effect this month.
Okay. And I have to ask this just from the standpoint of you can sometimes tell a lot by who's pushing back against these kinds of reforms. Who would stand in the way of these kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to organized crime, there's, or crime issues just in general. I mean, there's a lot of different interest groups. People worry that, having, strong policies on crime can, harm people that, vulnerable populations. But I think what we're seeing here is that having lax policies is what is in that way. And then in terms of, the pharmacy accreditations and all of that, what we're seeing is like the pharmacist groups and, pushing back against that. And so those are the groups that tend to stand up against these issues.
Well, do you feel more or less optimistic looking ahead? I mean, the trend right now is, as you mentioned in your article, CVS was it CVS shutting down 300 stores, or was that Walgreens? I can't remember, but that's a lot of stores. I mean, we're talking hundreds of stores being shut down. What would it take to reverse that trend?
I am optimistic. This is an issue that more people are becoming aware of. There's the USC Schaefer Center in, Southern California, and they're working on armed pharmacy deserts and kind of understanding where they're located, creating the data for that. And that'll help us know where we can work to get these pharmacies reopened and, getting the information out there for the public so more people can pressure these groups to reverse these trends.
Is there any hope for, I'm going to call it the mom and pop kind of drugstore, or has that ship sailed? It seems like during the lockdowns, especially, most of the mom and pop type businesses tended to fold. Is this the era of the bigger corporate stores, and is it going to stay that way for the foreseeable future?
A lot of the bigger corporate stores are closing, and they're kind of turning to more innovative business models, online based. And so I think that in terms of brick and mortar, we will see more mom and pop stores, especially in states where they're more amenable to small businesses. And so I'm a little bit more optimistic on that front, which is nice to say. I
appreciate your optimism. We're talking with McKenzie Richards. She is a Young Voices contributor. McKenzie, where can people follow you on social media?
Or you can follow me on Twitter at Mick_Richards. And that's where you can find my stuff.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. This is our fourth and final segment today. Happy to welcome Kenneth Schrupp back to the program. Kenneth, you're a familiar voice to a lot of our listeners, but for those meeting you for the first time, take a moment here. Tell them about who you are and what you do.
Hi, nice to see you again. My name is Kenneth Schrupp. I'm a Young Voices contributor and editor at the California Review, which is an independent journal in California. In addition to my time at Young Voices, I'm a public affairs consultant, and I tend to focus my works on the intersection of politics, business, and media.
Okay, you and I seem to spend a lot of time talking about some of the unique issues that are being faced in Los Angeles, housing being one of the big ones. And I got to admit, your optimism, I think, is very refreshing and probably something that more communities need, because I would have probably written off LA a long time ago, but you're in there, fighting to help make things happen. I'm looking at a recent article that you wrote for pacificresearch.org about the homeless assistance projects. And you make the case here that it's better to focus first on transformation than affordability. Talk to me about some of the things that are being done to help the homeless, and then help me understand why this clarification and where those efforts are best spent.
Of course. So in my latest piece at the Pacific Research Institute, I really explained our current system of homelessness funding and aid and what has to be done to get to a place where we have a system that's best for all and doesn't just move around homeless populations like a hot potato. Currently, homeless population treatment and funding is treated like a business. You get grants for the number of people that you serve, but not necessarily the amount of lives that you save and transform. So this really incentivizes people to create these massive programs that don't get people out of homelessness, that keep people cycling through these nonprofits without any real change in their life. We have a system where we have a very lucky few people who get the $700,000 single person apartments being built for them with full wraparound services, while you have people lining up on the streets in the thousands waiting to get a free apartment because they don't want to take any of these other units that we're offering in motels. There's something called Operation Inside Safe that our mayor has decided to put significant revenue towards, where these homeless individuals are offered free housing today. But many reject it because it comes with rules and stipulations. If you want to come in, they have to check and make sure you don't have weapons so you're not going to hurt someone. They don't want to have any of these rules. So they stay on the streets, and they often commit many crimes that go unaddressed, and they escalate. They get to a point where in Los Angeles in 2022, there was one individual who spent maybe a decade committing smaller crimes, but working their way up to violence, to shooting a flare gun into a moving car that had children in it, and then eventually walking into a store, a fine architecture store, and killing the person who was manning the store, who was a 24-year-old lady who was an architecture student at UCLA. It's not fair to let these people just sit out on the streets and wait until they die of an overdose, which many do. There was one trip in Los Angeles when one aid worker was trying to offer people housing, but she saw overdose after overdose happening. And these people only didn't die because there was a medical team attached to the social workers. These people would have all been dead. Is it really fair to let them stay out on the streets? So the solution we offer is, I think, both humane and rather simple. I think we need to expand mental health care courts to determine that people who commit crimes, who are mentally ill and or drug addicted, which is a very, very high number of individuals, that instead of sending them to jail, where they're not going to get better, they don't need to be locked up with hardened criminals, to put them into residential treatment programs that have very strict release terms, so that only when they're really ready for independence, when they're not going to cause damage to the communities that they're let out into, that we can put them into transitional housing. But the transitional housing now is mostly built in very high income areas, which is a waste of money. And also, these people are never going to be independent. Do you expect them on low skill wages to be able to afford an apartment in, say, Santa Monica on their own? No, they're going to be in transitional housing for their entire lives. They're never going to be on their own. And it creates hostility within the local population. Is this really the best way to spend our resources? But at the same time, you can't just throw these people where it's more affordable to live without significant safeguards. You're just going to be putting a hostile population there. But by having strict graduation standards and building these transitional units where it can be affordable for them to live as contributing members of society, we can significantly cut down on the number of homeless waiting on our streets.
You know, the thing that just jumped out at me from your article was I really have tended to view homelessness as just, well, it's a matter they just need some place to live. They need a roof over their heads. But you've just outlined there's a lot of other factors that play into it as to why people become homeless, as well as why they choose to stay homeless in some cases. Talk to me for a minute about, you mentioned these $700,000 apartments, that people were lining up to get. I'm curious, when someone is awarded one of those apartments, do they tend to take care of them, or is it kind of treated like, basically, is it subject to the tragedy of the commons, where, if they don't really feel responsibility for it, that they don't feel the incentive to care for it and to be good stewards?
Unfortunately, I can't really speak to that. There are very, very few of these units that have been completed since funding was awarded. I think it was in 2012. We decided to spend $10 billion building 10,000 units, but only a few thousand of them have been built and ever will be built due to the insanely high cost of construction. For reference, these apartments cost about as much as the median house in California that could house 5-6 people, or I don't know how many bedrooms, four bedrooms, 4 people. These are insane costs that we're paying to put people in extremely expensive neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I imagine there's probably some pushback from the residents of those neighborhoods in some cases. I'm sure Not in My Backyard is not something that's unique to one particular area of the country. Talk to me about the programs and the different organizations that administer these programs. Do they have the right incentives to make sure that they're actually helping people, as opposed to simply keeping the money flowing so that they have work to do? Does that make sense what I'm asking? In other words, do they find job security? As long as there's homeless, they've got job security. If they get too good at solving the problem, they may just find themselves out of work.
Let me give you a really great example of the kinds of organizations that are trying to run these projects. Just earlier this year, a measure came into effect called Measure ULA, which is a transfer tax on all properties worth over $5 million. They sold it as a mansion tax, but this really affects multifamily housing development the most. We have seen funding go to zero for multifamily housing that people will be able to afford to live in and rent. Los Angeles has the largest housing shortage of any city in the country. We have more people per room than San Francisco or New York, which shows how severe our housing shortage is. There's a group of nonprofit developers that wrote this Measure ULA to put in this transfer tax into place on all properties to make sure that all that money would go to them. They could wipe out their competitors who are for-profit or even mom-and-pop developers just building small projects to house normal families who want to pay rent, just so that they could get more money for their pie, more money for their programs, and have less competition. And meanwhile, they're cratering housing affordability for everyone else. Job security in exchange for housing affordability is a terrible, terrible combination.
Well, I applaud those people who are rolling up their sleeves and getting in there and trying to get it done. And I think the crux of what you're saying in your article is you have to be wise and be thinking ahead of what are the unintended consequences, what will this accomplish, as well as what are some of the things we don't want to see incentivized. Anybody in particular you want to give a shout out to as far as if people want to help out, say they have money they want to donate or resources, what are the organizations that you would steer them toward to help make that difference?
There are a few organizations that have seen really high success rates, well over 50%. One of them is local in Los Angeles, called Chrysalis. They help people get into very strict work-live programs where they have a set routine for graduation. And once they get through the program, they're living on their own. They're working great jobs, and they're contributing members of society. But it's very hard to scale these programs to a certain extent if you don't have the legal support from the city to continue managing them. Okay.
Well, listen, I applaud the work that you're doing, and I especially appreciate you shining some light on this issue. I know that a lot of us tend to get selective blindness, when it comes to the homeless. If we're walking down the street, well, I don't see them, and we don't. It's a problem we don't want to acknowledge. But Los Angeles, as you mentioned, has a massive problem they're contending with. And it sounds like there are some people taking some very serious steps to help. And I appreciate what you're doing to help bring that to light. Where can people follow you on social media? Where can they find your work?
You can find my work easily on social media, on Twitter at Kenneth Schrupp, KENNETH SCHRUPP, and at the California Review, whose website is calrev.org.
All right, Kenneth, great to catch up with you again. I look forward to our next update.
Thank you very much, Brian. You have a great day.